I'm particularly excited to introduce our next guest, who has an announcement on behalf of Governor and First Lady Snyder's administration. She's been a longtime friend and colleague. Currently, she is the director of the Michigan State Police. In fact, the first woman director of the Michigan State Police. Yay. And is one of many strong women who sits on Governor Snyder's cabinet. Colonel Christy Kibbe-Etu began her career with the Michigan State Police in 1987. And prior to her appointment as director, she served as the commander of the Emergency Management and Homeland Security Division. She's also been, I will tell you, however, over the course of her career, I've had the opportunity to know and work with her in many capacities, where she's always been a very strong advocate on working in a variety of arenas in her capacities on violence against women. And that includes very strong leadership in working on the untested kits in Detroit in the sexual assault arena, and in prevention work in sexual assault and domestic violence as well. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce you to Michigan State Police Colonel Christy Kibbe-Etu.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is truly my pleasure to be here and to provide some information to all of you about a brand new grant opportunity. But before I go into those details, I would first like to pause and thank our First Lady, Sue Snyder, for everything that she does, and especially putting her voice behind this topic. Could we give our First Lady a round of applause? Thank you. Also, our governor and our legislature, and our co-chairs. We have phenomenal legislators in this room with us today. Our senators from our House of Representatives who also have put their voice behind this cause. To preventing sexual assault on the campuses across this great state of Michigan. Today, we're going to propose $500,000 in grant funds in the fiscal year 2016 that will be made available to promote new efforts as it relates to the issues that we're discussing today at this summit. We are going to work to end sexual assault on Michigan's campuses. The grant funds that will be made available to the universities, colleges, and through the work of some community organizations to help educate and help prevent sexual assault will begin in 2016. The Michigan State Police will administer this grant, and we will be following guidelines that will become developed by a committee who will also review all the grant applications that come in when they're submitted. The committee will include a very broad and diverse group of individuals to ensure that the diverse needs on this topic and the diverse needs from students and the communities are met. Application requirements and the deadlines will be emailed to all colleges and universities as soon as they're made available. So again, the great announcement of $500,000 in grant funds in 2016 will help to support this initiative. And again, I commend our First Lady and our governor and the legislature for supporting this initiative. What's important to note that this is the first time that the state of Michigan has dedicated general funds that will actually work to prevent sexual assault in Michigan. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Colonel Etu. Just a reminder that we have 2 additional breakout sessions that are going to be coming up. So before I introduce our next speaker, I do want to remind you that at 1:55 we have our second breakout session, and that will include Messaging, marketing, and social media in room 201 and 202, which is on the second floor. Defense and empowerment tactics in room 103 on the first floor. Title IX, the right to an education free of sexual assault, in the governor's room on the second floor. And following session 2, we have our third session, which will begin at 2:45, and that will include law enforcement collaboration in the governor's room, measuring effectiveness, which will be in room 103 and 104, and student action plan development in room 201 and 202. So now to our introduction of our next general session speaker, who again is a Michigan University person and of whom we're very proud to have such expertise in our state, Dr. Antonia Abbey. Dr. Abbey is a psychology professor at Wayne State University, and her work centers on the role of alcohol and the role that it plays in sexual aggression and the survivor's recovery and sexual risk-taking. And we heard this morning from Emma about the role that she felt that that had in her own feelings about the sexual assault that she experienced. Dr. Abbey has published more than 100 journal articles and book chapters and served on a variety of national task forces and committees on the National Institutes of Health, Centers for Disease Control, and the National Institute of Justice and the Department of Defense. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Antonia Abbey.
Hello, everyone. How's that volume? Am I good? Okay. So I, too, want to thank the First Lady and the Governor and everyone else involved in planning this presentation. I'm just delighted to see how many people are here. I'm asked to give talks in a lot of different states, and it's really nice to see all these people in Michigan interested in wanting to work on this topic. So that's really exciting for me. And I hope that lunch wasn't too heavy, right? I'm sorry to be the first speaker after lunch. I know there's trade-offs with that. And so I'm gonna, in this presentation, and I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to keep looking to the side because I am used to using my presentation as kind of my notes and seeing what I'm talking about. So I'm gonna give you a little bit of a background to help put what I'm gonna say about alcohol in context. And then I'm gonna talk about alcohol's effects on perpetrators or potential perpetrators, talking about psychological effects as well as pharmacological effects. And I'm going to focus on the perpetrator first and primarily because, of course, if we want to prevent sexual assault, we want to focus on perpetrators. So alcohol, of course, also has effects on victims. They are going to have ideas about what the effects alcohol has and a pharmacological effect. I'll spend less time on that, not saying it's less important, just devoting time available, and then say just a little bit, hopefully if I don't say too much about the other things, about how I think we can use some of these ideas, and I'm very welcome to emails, conversations with people at another point if you have ideas that we didn't have time to get to here today. So let's start off with just a little background on college student drinking. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that there's a lot of drinking on college campuses, a lot of heavy drinking on college campuses. That was certainly true when I was in college. It was true before I went to college. It's been around a long time. The first number on that slide is to remind us that not everyone in college is drinking. So recent national studies showing about 1/3 of students saying that they hadn't consumed alcohol in the past month. So we have to watch stereotypes, right, that make us think everyone is drinking all the time. But the next number, right, is a little daunting that 1 in 5 students have an alcohol dependence type problem at some level. They may not always have these the rest of their life. Some people mature out of these, but so there's a lot of serious heavy drinking as well. And there are some gender differences and some gender parity in drinking that we might want to keep in mind as we're going through this. So if you ask, have you ever been drunk in your life? You can see that men and women have comparable rates, and it's quite high. But if you ask, have you had 5 or more drinks in about a 2-hour time period in the last 2 weeks. That's what you ask men. Women, you ask 4 or more drinks, because slightly smaller on average tends to be that they don't need as much alcohol to reach the same BAC. So for most people, that would get you to a 0.08, so a point where you shouldn't be driving. And you can see that there is a gender disparity, but it's still a quite high rate of students saying they've done this in the last 2 weeks, right? And then if you get up to 10 or more, you see that that's more common among men than women, but still a substantial number of students, right, drinking heavily, very heavily, in a 2-week period. And there are some differences in terms of like the demographics, what we know about students who drink heavily. So besides being men, it does tend to be more often Caucasian students as opposed to ethnic minority students, more often students who are living in off-campus housing of some type, a little bit harder to drink in the dorm usually. Often if they're affiliated with a Greek institution, if they're athletes. There are also characteristics of campuses that have more heavy drinking, so the social climate of the university has an effect on what people think is the right thing to do and what they feel comfortable doing. So campuses like mine at Wayne State, where we have more part-time students and older students, tend to have lower rates of heavy drinking than students that don't have that kind of a profile. And if there's a lot of alcohol outlets nearby that cater to students, you tend to have heavier drinking. And I'm not going to read you all those numbers, and I'm sure you can't all see all those numbers, but this is a slide that talks about the many different negative consequences associated with heavy drinking. So there are people that annually try to figure out all the costs that college students experience associated with heavy drinking. Death, other types of fatalities, STDs, other types of serious problems. So sexual assault is a very important problem. Obviously, that's what brought us here together today, but we could also think there's a lot of reasons we might want to address heavy drinking on campuses that go beyond sexual assault. Okay, so the best estimate I have is that about half of all sexual assaults involve alcohol. There's some variability, so it's higher at some places, lower at other places. Again, the climate of a university can change. So what does that tell us? If we got rid of drinking and no one ever drank, would we maybe get rid of half of all sexual assaults? We certainly wouldn't get rid of sexual assault, right? Because plenty happen without alcohol. And when we know that two things are highly related, there's some stat class kind of information floating around in your brain, right, that says correlation doesn't equal causality, right? That just because things co-occur, it doesn't mean one causes the other. So just because alcohol and sexual assault co-occur frequently, it doesn't mean the alcohol necessarily causes the sexual assault. Maybe in some circumstances, someone wouldn't have been sexually aggressive without drinking. Maybe sometimes the causality is actually the opposite direction. So somebody feels like acting out, being sexually aggressive, being forceful, and they drink as an excuse, as a justification, both to other people and to themselves, that they can feel more comfortable because our society allows people to act out when they're drinking often. And then it could be that it's really due to some underlying cause. For example, people with an impulsive personality tend to drink more, and they also tend to be more likely to commit sexual assault. So it might be that underlying personality or early childhood experiences with victimization or violence that might be underlying these links. So it's a complicated relationship. And this isn't a multiple choice test where the answer is A, B, or C. It's really all of the above, that we think alcohol plays different types of roles in different types of sexual assaults, so that we can't just have a one-size-fits-all approach to alcohol. We have to look at each circumstance separately and see what was going on. Another thing I want to point out early, and remember to say that I am talking mostly in a context of a female victim and a male perpetrator, and I definitely agree that that does not explain all violence that happens on college campuses. So certainly there are male victims, female perpetrators, things that happen in same-sex relationships. Most of the research, and especially the alcohol research, focuses on heterosexual dynamics, so that will be what I'm mostly talking about, and then we'll have to make inferences about how it would fit in other scenarios. So I will kind of say he when I'm talking about perpetrators, because that's the case in the data that I'm looking at, but to make it clear that's not the assumption that all perpetrators are. So there are a lot of studies that show some common characteristics of men who say they've committed sexual assault, and these are from community studies, from college studies, also incarcerated samples, but the majority of these are not incarcerated samples. So these are people that are self-report on confidential, anonymous questionnaires that they've committed an act of sexual aggression, and then they also fill out other information about themselves. So there are early childhood experiences, there are personality traits, there are attitudes that are frequently related to being likely to be a sexual assault perpetrator. Now, just because you know someone who's highly narcissistic, that doesn't mean they're a perpetrator, right? So any of these can happen without someone being sexually aggressive. And the more of these that someone experiences, so if someone's narcissistic and they have really hostile attitudes toward women, and they learn growing up that violence is how you get what you want out of life, well, then that person is more likely to be sexually aggressive because they've really been learned that that's what pays off for them and that they have the right to get what they want out of life. So the more of these that co-occur in a person, the more likely they are to be sexually aggressive. So you can see alcohol is in that long list, but it is a long list of factors. So I think of alcohol in a probabilistic manner. It's just one more factor that could kind of tip the scales, have someone cross that line and act in a sexually aggressive manner in a certain occasion, but it can happen without alcohol. And some of these other factors can be what tips the equation. And the other way to look at it is that someone who isn't at all aggressive in their nature is not going to be sexually aggressive just because they were drinking, right? Because again, it takes a co-occurrence of multiple factors. So alcohol alone doesn't totally change people in that kind of way. Now there's a lot going on in this model, definitely no quiz at the end, but I want to kind of highlight as a kind of theme for what I'm talking about that I have a column for perpetrators and a column for victims, so noting that alcohol affects both individuals. And also then I have a box for things that we bring into a situation, our beliefs and attitudes that we kind of bring into any interaction we have with another person. We have beliefs about alcohol that make a difference. Then there's the pharmacological effects of alcohol in that actual interaction. And then there is how people think about what happened after the assault and how alcohol affects that. So I'm not going to be able to give all of this justice, but give you a sense, of, again, of a way it's complicated as all these things come together when we think about alcohol. So thinking about a perpetrator, a potential perpetrator, and why it matters what they think about alcohol's effects on them. Well, what does the average college student expect when they drink? What is someone's reasons for drinking, huh? Slightly smaller group, I'd do a show of hands for some things, maybe not an audience participation size group, but think for a minute for yourself, huh? So I have a few slides here. Alcohol helps you feel more relaxed with people you don't know well. Alcohol is a social lubricant, if you've heard that expression. So there's a lot of new experiences, new challenges in college, figuring out how to fit in, how to get along. If you think alcohol makes it easier to talk to people, if it reduces some social anxiety, that's a motive to drink before you're in a social interaction. Alcohol lowers sexual inhibitions. There are so many Bacardi ads, it's really hard to pick just one to put in a presentation. So this guy is definitely feeling like alcohol is making his night go better, right? And we don't get to look at the women's faces and know what they're thinking here, right? So there's a lot of cultural norms and beliefs that associate alcohol and sex, and I'm going to talk about that for a bit. And then alcohol increases aggression. So it's not just sexual aggression. In general, we think that people might be more aggressive when they drink. This is fans after a football game, I believe, was what went with it. But, so it's not, again, we have to put sexual aggression sometimes in a larger context. Alcohol affects a variety of aggressive behaviors. So I would love to eliminate this slide that talks about stereotypes about drinking women. I did some research on this topic before I think some of you in the room were born, and I keep thinking one of these days this is going right out of the presentation, it's going out of the Psych of Women book that I use, it's not going to be relevant anymore. But people keep doing surveys that keep finding studies that find supportive results. So there are still double standards about when women drink heavily as compared to men, and when women have a lot of sexual partners or have sex with someone they don't know well. So despite the hookup norms and the casual sex norms, there's still a lot of research talking about the way men get talked about afterwards versus the way women get talked about afterwards, and the vocabulary is not the same, and not one that I will use in this group, right? So one way that researchers might look at this is they have people read a story, just a short story. And you're reading about a couple who are on a date, and you can see in this picture here, or perhaps you can see they have some champagne. So they have 2 glasses of champagne or wine or beer. They're not drinking very much. Or they have 2 glasses of water or soda. And then you fill out a survey about what you thought of the people involved, and particularly what you thought of the woman and her likely sexual behavior with this person and with other people. So all that buried in the story was what the woman drank, and that was kind of embedded in a bunch of other cues in the story. So women who are portrayed as having 2 drinks are seen as more sexually available, more interested in having sex with this man this evening, more interested in having sex with a lot of men in general. People would be more likely to use the word promiscuous to apply to her. I don't think most of us sitting here would think we would do that, right? 2 drinks. You know, we'd hope we wouldn't do it if someone had 10 drinks, but certainly not 2 drinks. So this is, again, the sense that these are very overlearned kind of stereotypes in our society, and we're not always thinking about it, but they're in the back of our mind sometimes, kind of in our unconscious mind, so that they have an effect on how we think about people even when we're not aware of it. And so expectancies are really important to psychologists. I'm a social psychologist, and social psychologists study them a lot, again, not just in the sexual domain, because if we walk into a situation expecting something, we tend to see what we want to see. So if you walk into a situation expecting someone to be nice and friendly, you'll give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe if they're shy and they mumble a lot or they look down when they're talking. But if you walked in thinking they were arrogant and not nice and stuck up, then if they engage in those same behaviors, you're going to say, yeah, see what I thought? They're a jerk, right? So the exact same behavior, but interpreted differently because of your expectancies. So there's tons of studies that show how our beliefs about people affect how we treat them, and then often how they treat us, right? So it becomes self-fulfilling in some situations because of that. So that's why these beliefs matter, and I'm kind of emphasizing them as something that is a prelude potentially to a sexual assault. And then alcohol in some people's mind, although it shouldn't, can cause confusion about was that sex consensual or not. So again, in this type of study where people might read a story and react to it, you can imagine that the story goes further. So after they've had these drinks at dinner, they go back to the woman's apartment, they engage in some consensual sexual activity. Some point the woman says no and the man keeps forcing. This is a very common acquaintance rape type of situation that a lot of victims tell. And in this scenario, when people write it, the man very clearly uses a lot of force. The woman clearly protests so that they want to make it super clear this was rape. There was no way you can think this woman wanted it. And again, early on there were 2 alcoholic drinks, or early on there was water or some other beverage. And then people's task is to just circle a number on a scale like this, right? So on a 1 to 7 scale, is this not at all consensual or completely consensual? And the way the story was told, you expect everyone to circle the 1. This was not at all consensual. And reminding you that people are sober when they do this, so alcohol is not affecting them at the time. If they read about people who hadn't drank earlier that evening, most people circle the 1. If they read a situation where the woman had had a few drinks earlier in the evening, they're more likely to circle a 3. Now, they're not going all the way up to 7. They're not saying this was completely consensual, but despite force and protest, they are seeing some ambiguity about if this was a completely forced interaction. And the drinking was hours earlier. It wasn't at the time. So imagine if the drinking was 5 minutes earlier, right? And she was under the influence of that drinking. So again, this is just the subtle effects that alcohol has on us that we've learned since we were very young. Children by the age of 5 know how alcohol affects grown-ups. They have watched grown-ups. They see the movies. They look at the ads. So we learn these messages very early in life before we're engaging in our own dating and sexual behavior. Okay, so turning then to the pharmacological effects of alcohol. So someone walks into a situation with these beliefs, then they start drinking. There are a lot of cognitive impairments associated with alcohol. It only takes about 2 drinks for that to occur. I know a lot of people go, oh, no way, or not me, I've got a much better tolerance. But they do a lot of neuropsychological tests in the lab, and the effects start off subtle. They get more obvious as you go along. But even with just a few drinks, people start acting slightly differently in their cognitions. And Alcohol affects a lot of the parts of the brain, but it has a lot of effects on the prefrontal cortex, what some people call the area of executive cognitive functioning. And they call it the executive because that's the idea of that's where the tough decisions are made. That's the part of the brain where we bring in conflicting evidence, we weigh pros and cons and consequences, and we make decisions. So when we're drinking, that part of our brain is not working well. It's not up to speed. So we tend to look at what is most obvious, most salient. That's why the beer goggles expression makes sense, because people are just looking at what's right in front of their face and being affected by that. People are also not good at holding back. If you want to do something, you want to do it. And it's really hard to put on the brakes and stop yourself from doing what you want to do. And people often tend to feel less of the stress or anxiety we feel when we know we might be taking a risk. So when that's turned off, you feel even more comfortable than acting on how you feel in that moment, rather than thinking, is this really the right thing to do now? Okay, so how do we look at this? So I want to tell you a little bit, not in too much detail, but a little bit about lab research. So I have a lab at Wayne State where we administer alcohol, and there are a lot of rules about alcohol administration. So someone has to be 21 or older. I keep wanting to have Canadian colleagues so I could have 19 or older and follow their laws. But they have to be someone who has drank the amount you're going to give them, so you're not for the first time exposing them to a certain quantity of alcohol. And they also can't have serious alcohol problems that you might be exaggerating. And of course, what's great about bringing people into the lab is then you control who drinks or not. It's not that somebody had a bad day or just took an exam and you know that they're like in the mood that they really want to get wasted and act out. It's by the flip of a coin who drinks and who doesn't that day. So differences between individuals should be counterbalanced because it's that flip of the coin, and this should really help us know about alcohol's causal effects. Now, as you can imagine, the challenge in the lab is that we are not going to then obviously give someone a chance to be sexually aggressive. So you have to figure out how can you look at what you care about and in a safe and ethical way. And so a lot of people do things like I was telling you about, is where there's a story in a sense that people are exposed to. Sometimes it's a video, sometimes it's a written story. That's not so great when people are drinking, right? Sometimes it's an audio tape. I'm experimenting in my lab with a virtual reality simulation so that people have more opportunities to interact with the stimuli and make decisions as they go. But basically then, how people say they would act if they were in that situation, how they feel about the man and the woman in that situation, is our window into what we think how alcohol is affecting perpetrators in the moment as they're making their decisions, consciously or unconsciously, about what to do next. Okay, so people drink to about a 0.08 in my lab. Sometimes people go to a 0.10 in some labs. They have to then hang around a long time to their detox, so these are long time periods. We get to know our participants very well. And what you find on average across studies when you compare men who are sober in these circumstances to men who are intoxicated, and again, these are not all or nothing black and white differences. It's shading a degree, right, with these kind of 1 to 5, 1 to 7 kind of scales, that intoxicated men are more likely to find what happens sexually arousing. They're more likely to say that they're angry. You know, that woman wasn't treating them right when she said no to sex, to feel that she owed them sex at that point in time, to believe that the woman enjoyed it, despite the fact that there are no signs of enjoyment included, to think that the man acted appropriately. So what he did when he continued to push and force sex, despite the woman saying no, was okay under the circumstances, and that they would be likely to do something similar, to use a similar level of force themselves. So again, we don't know what these people would actually do when they're drinking, but we're seeing them say that they would be more likely to act in a sexually aggressive manner. So this is when we think that alcohol might play a causal role. But it's also important to look at that sentence that I have in bold at the bottom, which is, again, it tends to be an interaction with these risk factors that I had on an early slide, so that men who are already predisposed to be hostile toward women, to enjoy sex because they enjoy being dominant to another person, factors like that, those then are the men that are most likely in these lab studies when they're drinking to have the strongest pro-assault kind of viewpoints and behaviors that they endorse, okay? studies do show there's a fair number of men in society at large, as well as in colleges, that say they have committed some act of sexual aggression since college. These would not all fit a definition of rape. They could not all go to criminal justice authorities, but they would all fit in Title IX kind of framework. And so then researchers are just now starting to ask more questions about, are there patterns over time? Because I think when we're thinking about prevention, that's really important to think about. If we see change in people's behavior, what's linked to that change, and how can we then kind of grasp onto that and create programs that might create change and look at different groups differently? So the numbers, what I'm showing you up here is when you look at men who have acknowledged that they've committed an act of sexual aggression since the age of 14, and they are currently college students, but they might have done it just before they came to college, or they might have done it in college only, or they might have done it at both points in time. So there are surveys given to students, and I think there are 3 now that have tried to track students through most of their college experience, so getting people like right when they come to campus or the summer before they come, asking them to reflect on their high school experience, and then at the end of each year of college, or at least several years into college. You can imagine this is expensive and hard to keep track of people over time, to then ask them about this. And people are willing to acknowledge engaging in these behaviors if the questionnaires, again, are anonymous and confidential, and things are phrased in a way that isn't threatening to people. So if you're looking at the slide, if you can read it from where you're sitting, you've already read everything I have up there. We found, these studies tend to find 3 different groups. So there are men that report that they committed an act of sexual aggression in high school, but not in college, so they appear to not be engaging in this behavior in college. So there's something in the college environment that is inhibiting or stopping this behavior. That sounds good, right? The next group are people who did not engage in this behavior in high school, but they are engaging in this behavior in college. So they are starting. We can actually engage in primary prevention if we can figure out how to alter the social norms, the rewards, the environment, whatever it is that making people feel comfortable engaging in this behavior in college that haven't up to this point. And then there are people who engage in this behavior at different points in the lifespan. So both high school and college, haven't seen studies follow them longer than that have a different pattern. And the reason I'm telling you this in an alcohol talk is because we have seen some signs that this is related to alcohol. And as a researcher, I feel compelled, probably more than you care, to say when this is preliminary data. There aren't a lot of studies that have done this, so we certainly need more evidence. But again, I think that when we're thinking about prevention, and there's so little that we have to do evidence-based, it's worth thinking about these kind of ideas. So the life course persistent group that start early and continue appear to have a host of what you might call problematic behaviors. So they probably have early childhood experiences that put them on a path that is likely to lead to more violence in a variety of settings. So violence against women, but also other types of violence. So they might need most intensive services and programs. And then both patterns that involve change, so either starting or stopping, also seem to be occurring at the same point that someone is drinking more heavily, particularly in situations where they're hoping to have some sexual experiences. They're saying that alcohol makes it easier to engage in sexual behavior, and they're engaging in more casual sex. So when those things are changing, sexual aggression seems to change as well, which again is not saying what is the cause of what, but suggesting there's a nexus of factors there that we might want to try and understand better and look at more carefully. And one more study related to that, there's a study that's going on right now, and they've got, I think, 2 or 3 years of their data already collected, not in the state of Michigan, but they are following state university students. And in the second semester of college, they asked first-year men if they were willing to fill out like a daily diary online for 8 weeks. And again, of course, there were inducements to motivate people, so it wasn't the entire undergraduate first-year male population doing it. But that there was a fair number of men who were willing to do this, and they were asked to report on both their sexual behavior and their drinking behavior and the time of day that it occurred. So they could try and look at what came first, the drinking or the sex. Do they co-occur? And if they do co-occur, at least what order did they happen in? And what they found was that on the days that these first-year male college students reported drinking, they were more likely in the next 4 hours to have sex with a new partner. And what was interesting, disturbing, they were likely to have sex consensual sex with a new partner, they were likely to have non-consensual, so forced sex with a new partner. So that it seemed to be about this desire to have sex with a new partner, and some people know where to stop, right? And it will stop, but other people will keep pushing at that point and not stop. So again, this is new data coming out, but I think that again, as we're trying to develop programs that look at alcohol and current pressures that college students feel, these are important to be thinking about. And I'm emphasizing new partner because it was only with a new partner. So alcohol was not more likely to be involved when someone had sex with a previous partner, again, neither whether it was forced sex or not. And we often focus on the sexual assaults that occur at parties. Those are really obvious ones, and they are often the ones that involve alcohol, but there are a lot of sexual assaults, right, that occur more in private, occur in more of a relationship. So it gets closer to the relationship violence kind of sexual assault, but college students often experience that as well. So we have to be careful not to assume this explains all sexual assaults. But again, some that are occurring, and we could certainly perhaps develop some programs to address. Okay. So the victim's alcohol consumption, so a potential victim is going to be exposed to the same messages in our society about links between alcohol and sex, and also is going to have the same pharmacological effects of alcohol on them. We're awake, right? Okay. And you know, women have the same expectancies that men have, and then they have the challenge of knowing that there's some social norms that they have to be careful to sometimes not break, but women, too, want to be able to have fun at parties, have fun in college. They want to get to know people that they don't know well. Maybe they want to take a few risks in their relationship, but risk is defined as meeting new people and getting involved with different types of people, not a risk like sexual assault, obviously. Want to feel comfortable engaging in casual sex, that's something that they can do if they want to do. So alcohol can make women want to preload, if we want to use that term, right, before going to a party, just like men, so that they can walk in there feeling a little more confident and a little more comfortable. And alcohol then will have the same type of cognitive impairments for women as for men, and in some of the alcohol administration studies, you see that women who have been drinking sometimes have a harder time perceiving risk. Now, when I say that, I don't want to make it sound like it is a victim's responsibility to perceive risk, right? No one should be taking advantage of someone, whether they're intoxicated or not, but that they do seem to maybe not notice the guy's attempts quite as early or as quickly, that he's trying to get them alone, he keeps trying to isolate them from their friends, things that sometimes might give someone a chance to get away. But again, there's no victim blame intended there, simply the acknowledgement that alcohol will affect a woman's ability to process information in that situation. And perpetrators are aware of that, so sometimes perpetrators use that knowledge, right, for who they target. So they might look around the party and see who looks like they're already a little kind of woozy and not standing so well, and that's who they go over and ask to dance and make friends with. It's also the case that sometimes a perpetrator can simply encourage someone to drink more, so keep refilling their drink, right, so it's hard for them to keep track, encourage them to have strong drinks. So there's lots of ways that alcohol can be used, not so much like forcing it down someone's throat, right, but just encouraging someone in a social situation when they're drinking anyway to drink a little bit more, or to take advantage of that person who's sitting there by themselves drinking heavily. And I've had the Colt 45 ad for a long time from a billboard, you know, just to kind of show this has been going on a long time. But then there's that Bud label that recently had to get withdrawn, right? Because obviously their marketing team was not really thinking to. Maybe they'd had a few too many Bud Lights that night. So that this is a message that, again, has been around a while, right? Candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker. And we can think of lots of those things that kind of suggest that alcohol will make a woman more interested and eager to have sex. And then if that doesn't work, it can be easy to cross that line into force for someone already pre-inclined to be forceful. Okay. Do I have a minute still? Okay. So sometimes I have like 10 slides on what can we do next, so I'm just going to have one slide, and again, this is a dialogue that can occur over time, and I think many people in this room probably have great ideas that I don't have, since it's been a while since I've been a student in college. One thing I think we need is more coordination of alcohol and sexual assault program staff, both in terms of programs that are implemented as well as policies that are implemented. Usually I see head nodding at this point, so occasionally there's a school where there's already a good integration, but most of the time people agree that their offices are pretty separate. I think it was maybe in Wisconsin, but I'm forgetting now, where they talked about their, you know, on the same side of the elevator on the same floor, but they still don't talk to each other much, right? We've all got so much to do, it's hard sometimes to go talk to other people who might have a shared agenda. There are actually a fair number of demonstrated effective interventions to reduce college students' heavy drinking. Now, I'm not saying eliminate, right, but that you can see in randomized controlled trials that with brief motivational interviewing, there is a reduction in heavy drinking among some students. So we do know something, and again, it's not a panacea that works for everyone, but we know something about how to reduce heavy drinking. And a lot of it does involve the idea of motivational interviewing, which I don't know if people are familiar with, but what I like about it is the sense that you're encouraging the individual to see for themselves ways in which alcohol is fun and helpful for them, but ways in which alcohol impedes them reaching some of the goals that they have. So it's about them deciding that alcohol is not working for them all the time, and to think about where they want to drink and when they want to drink and how much they want to drink a little bit more thoughtfully, but not so much that somebody else is saying, you've got to do this or else, right? Because that tends to get reactance from people, and they don't necessarily want to do what we have to want to say. And at the same level with sexual assault prevention programs, I think that there's a lot we can do with student input that might work on policies about alcohol, but students have to buy into it, right? Otherwise, there's going to be lots of ways to work around it and maybe make things even worse. I've heard people tell stories about, well, if there's no drinking in the dorm, everybody goes to these fraternities that are off campus and are isolated, and once young women are at these fraternities, it's very hard for them to get away from the men and from the perpetrators. I guess it's someplace where can't call a cab or something. But so again, that sense of that by taking it off campus, it actually created more opportunities to isolate women among men who wanted to do that. So we have to think carefully, I think, about different policies, but I think there are policies that students might appreciate and like if we work together on that. So I'm going to stop there, except to acknowledge, that I have had a lot of collaborators over time. I think the students of at least one of my collaborators are in the room somewhere. So some of these people have gone on to become faculty at different Michigan schools. And I've got a lot of funding from the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, and they just really get a lot of credit for funding violence research where a lot of institutes are not doing so. And I have a recent review paper that if you find all this interesting, but you somehow didn't manage to write down everything I said, right? Or you want to know more about some of the studies, I am happy to share that kind of information with you, so feel free to just reach out for me at some point. Thank you very much.
All right, there, everyone. Thanks for your time. We're going to move to the breakout sessions now. We do have some light refreshments in the back if you're interested.